Alright, so we're back working on the Raptor and still trying to figure out why there is an odd pulsing noise when the truck is rolling at speeds below 25 miles per hour. Last time I thought that it was a wheel bearing, but ended up finding a busted ball joint on the driver's side. After swapping it out, the noise was still there, and I decided to pull the old wheel bearing and hub assembly to see if there was any notable damage to the axle, IWE, or hub gears. Step 1 for me was safely lifting the driver's side and pulling the wheel using wheel chocks, a jack, and a jack lock since I don't have large enough jack stands here, along with a 21mm socket and an impact gun to completely pull the wheel off, and then I threw the wheel under the truck for additional safety. Step 2 is pulling off the brake caliper and rotor using a 21mm socket and a breaker bar. There are quite a few bolts back there, so I had to make sure and loosen the 21mm hex heads and pull off the whole caliper, and then I hung the caliper up on the upper control arm using some baling wire and pulled the rotor off and set it aside. Step 3 is removing the old wheel hub assembly. I used a pry bar to pull off the axle nut cap and then a 13mm deep socket to pull off the axle nut before I remembered that I needed to disconnect the wheel speed sensor. The wheel speed sensor connection is located under the hood, just below the brake master cylinder and on top of the wheel well liner. I had to pull a small red clip lock outward and then press the release, which is where the old clip used to sit. It's a little awkward to get in there. But I finally figured that out, and then I disconnected it. Once I got it disconnected, I could use a rivet puller and an 8mm socket to pop the wire off its various connection locations all the way down to the wheel hub. Now I could remove the 4 bolts holding on the wheel hub using a 21mm socket and breaker bar. But I also wanted to be safe while working around the IWE, so I put 25 psi vacuum on the IWE using a vacuum pump. Once all 4 bolts are out, I could pull off the wheel bearing and hub assembly. I've got to be honest here, this was very anticlimactic. There was no visible damage on anything. The hub looked fine, the axle and the IWE teeth looked fine, and when the axle was straight, the IWE was perfectly flush. So I watched a bunch of different wheel bearing videos right after this, where people described the various indications of wheel wobble and grindy feeling in the hub, and I had none of those to point to why I thought it was the wheel bearing and hub. The only positive thing I heard was a Chris Fix video where he said that you might not be able to reproduce any of the effects, but the wheel bearing could still be bad. So I decided to carry on, and I cleaned out all of the old grease from the spindle and IWE, then cleaned the spindle and hub mating surface using a wire wheel. Step 4 is reinstallation of the wheel bearing and hub assembly. I packed the inside of the IWE with grease, rubbed some anti-seize on the mating surface, and initially forgot about the hub side and had to pull it all back apart to rub the high temp wheel bearing grease onto the hub side also. I made sure that the IWE still had some vacuum on it, slid the sensor wire under the brake dust shield, and slid the hub onto the axle and flush up against the spindle. Then I threw some red Loctite onto the bolts and threaded them through the back of the spindle and into the hub. I tightened those down right away in a diagonal pattern and torqued them to 129 foot-pounds. I put some red Loctite on the axle also, and then tightened that down quick using the Milwaukee, and then checked to make sure that it was snug while holding the axle. The torque value for this is 30 foot-pounds, but it's a little difficult to actually torque that down. The last part of this reinstallation is running the wheel speed sensor to the connector and tapping in the axle nut dust cover. Step 5 is reinstalling the rotor and brake caliper using a 21mm socket, red Loctite, and torquing it down to 185 foot-pounds. Step 6 was reinstalling the wheel and tire, torquing the lug nuts down to 150 foot-pounds, and reconnecting the IWE vacuum hose. If you forget to reconnect the vacuum hose, you're going to have a bad day. So final thoughts on this. The wheel bearing was my problem. I've driven about 200 miles since the swap, and the sound and vibration is completely gone. I'm glad that this is where it can stop for me for now. I've been spending way too much this year between the Jeep, 2 homes, and the Raptor's new wheels and tires, so when I spoke with my wife about this and laid out things that it could be, I did it in order of cost, with the most likely for me being the IWE wheel bearing or axle. The noise was still there in 4 high, so I thought that it had to be the wheel bearing, which is why I put that on order. The IWE system is a headache in general because there are so many things that could be wrong. Ford put out a technical service bulletin, or TSB, for some vehicles that basically eliminated the IWE by capping off the vacuum lines. But the Raptor, they had put out a TSB on just the software, which would put vacuum on the hubs only after driving a certain distance. This would ensure that there would be no issue with partial vacuum when the vehicle first starts. If you are unaware of the TSB, or if you haven't had that software change and you try and diagnose an issue, then you could have problems. So it might be easier to diagnose by first replacing the check valve and solenoid, since those are relatively cheap, and using a vacuum pump at various locations to test for leaks. Letting an issue with the IWE or the vacuum system go for too long will result in damage to the hub and IWE at the minimum, and possibly the axle. So if you're not confident enough to do it yourself, take it to a mechanic. If you're one of those people who say, if you want to play, you got to pay, you're probably a jerk. But the fact is that maintenance can be expensive, so always keep a rainy day fund for that. Anyway, I hope that this video helped someone. YouTube is not a replacement for a mechanic, and I'm just some dude with a GoPro. So if you want better advice, check out FordRaptorForums.com or see a real mechanic. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.